All right, good afternoon, good morning to people from the US, good afternoon to people from Central Europe. I think we can start with our event right now, which is on the topic USA back to multilateralism, the Iran nuclear deal and the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. This is already our fourth event in a series where we dealt with different topics concerning USA back to multilateralism. We had one about the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We had one of the what will be after the inauguration of Joe Biden as a new president, and we had one on the New START. And today we talk about the Iran nuclear deal and a nuclear weapon-free zone with our 5 excellent speakers, whom I will go to introduce in a second. Maybe just very shortly again, as it is 5 speakers and we're only having 1 hour, 20 minutes, I would like to kindly ask you to stick to 7 to 10 minutes for your first initial remarks so that we still have time then to discuss with our participants. And they're also already welcome to our participants. And please feel free if you have any questions to pose it in the Q&A question section below. You can see Q&A. Please feel free to question anyone, to give a question to all, and I will go through it during the discussion. As we know, we're facing now 3 developments in the Middle East, which is especially the possible return to the Jcpoa, the nuclear Iran, the so-called Iran nuclear deal. There were the Abraham Accords, the kind of normalization treaties between the US, Israel and some Arab states, respectively Bahrain, the Emirates, Morocco and Sudan. So will this lead to a power shift? And then we also have the already long discussion about the possibility of setting up a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which is also one development where we will take a look at. Of course, different actors have their different interests in there. But so there we also would then like to see like how the European Union will respond to that. What is the European role in the region in general? What role of the US, but also about multilateralism and the whole context of international security. To kick off the discussion, I would like to start with ERZSÉBET Rózsa. So welcome, ERZSÉBET. It is a pleasure to see you. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute of World Economics in Budapest, and I had the honor to meet her here in Vienna, I think now already close to 2 years ago. And she was also part of a book which was edited by HEINZ, GÄRTNER and Mitra Shamoradi, which dealt with the Iranian international system. Shireen has also been part of that, so it's very nice to see you on Zoom. And I would like to start with you just to give a short, like an overview, like on the 3 concepts, like what do they link? Are they transformative? Especially the Abraham Accords have to be seen or were at least named as having a transformative power, setting new facts on the ground. So what does the Jcpoa, the Iran nuclear deal, and the nuclear weapon-free zone in light of the Abraham Accords mean for the future? And do the Abraham Accords actually add additional value to the possible re-establishment of the Jcpoa? So the first 7 to 10 minutes for you, ERZSÉBET. So success story or not, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Vielen Dank. And thank you for the International Institute for Peace for inviting me not only to the book project, but also to this event. I am very happy to be here, and I would like to share with you just 2 slides that I did, because you asked me 3 questions, which are 3, although very much interrelated questions, but 3 different issues. So just on my first slide, I would like to point out a couple of differences, and then I would go to how they can be contacted or differentiated and so on. So the first one is, if we look at these 3 issues that you raised, Stephanie, who are the potential parties who are involved? With the Middle Eastern nuclear weapon-free zone, or WMD-free zone for that matter, it is all the Arab League states, Israel and Iran, but interestingly, Turkey is left out. At the same time, we have to note that those Arab states which are located on the African continent, they are already under the Pelindaba Treaty members or parties to a nuclear weapon-free zone, the African nuclear weapon-free zone. With the Jcpoa, the parties, the number of the parties is much more limited. We have the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and Germany. Mind you, Germany has become a permanent member over this issue, or almost, and Iran, of course, plus the European Union as such appeared at some stage, and minus the US since 2018. With the Abraham Accords, as you said, Stephanie, it is Israel and the Emirates, Israel and Bahrain, Israel and Morocco, Israel and Sudan. Although there is a huge distinction between the Middle Eastern nuclear weapon-free zone issue and between the Abraham Accords, in the sense that while on the nuclear weapon-free zone, there has seemed to be so far an Arab consensus, on the Abraham Accords, on the other hand, has broken down an Arab consensus, probably the only other Arab consensus, namely over Palestine. If we look at the perceived threat in the 3 different cases, with the nuclear weapon-free zone, it is first the Israeli nuclear capability, which we taken for granted, confirmed, in spite of the fact that it has never been confirmed really, and the Iranian nuclear program. I do not say capability because nuclear is civilian and so on. For the Jcpoa, it is the Iranian nuclear program, obviously. With the Abraham Accords, we can only say that it is about the recognition of the State of Israel, which has been on the agenda, which has a different kind of a perceived threat or threat perception. Now, the forums are also different where these are discussed. The first one, the nuclear weapon-free zone, usually the NPT review conferences, but then Israel is not there. Israel is not a party to the NPT. So it has been brought into under the umbrella of the United Nations, and especially since 2019, when the first conference on a Middle East zone free from non-conventional weapons has been launched. Now the coronavirus has postponed the next event and so on. So this was already a problematic. Is it a nuclear weapon-free zone or a WMD-free zone? The 2 things were running in parallel. With the Jcpoa, the biggest problems usually are that what about the other issues? In my understanding, President Obama took the notion and the track that start with one issue, build trust, and then follow with the others. While with the Trump understanding, if I understood it well, it was go for everything at all at the same time. The biggest problem as we hear is that the region, direct region, indirect region, wider away region is left out. And with the Abraham Accords, the big questions will be in the implementation, obviously. As we have seen, there are already some problems. And obviously about the sequencing of the issues. Is it peace first, disarmament later, as the Arabs would like to have it? Or is it, or as Israel would like to have it? Or is it disarmament first and peace afterwards? And now I would like to jump, I hope I can jump to, yes, to this slide where I just checked, I know the time is running, at the potential cross impacts as I see them. So what impact the Jcpoa may have on the WMD-free zone? First of all, the Jcpoa was announced after the conclusion of the 2015 NPT conference, which ended in spring. In May, the Jcpoa was announced and signed in July 14th. So definitely, although it has been on the agenda, but concretely as an already signed agreement, it was not on the agenda yet. The next NPT review conference should have taken place last year, but it was postponed to this year because of the coronavirus. Definitely the Jcpoa will be an issue, and definitely the big question will be, I think that Shireen will address the Jcpoa in details, if there is a return to the JCPOA. I would so much like to be optimistic, but I am not very at this precise moment. If there is a return to the JCPOA by both the US and Iran, what impact that may have on the promotion of the idea of a zone? Because Israel would still be out. So that is a big question. Even if the US joins, the big question from the point of view of the zone, what can we do to convince Israel to come to join the zone? Vice versa, I have to state that when I was preparing for this short presentation, I checked the 1995 NPT resolution on the Middle East. And it already did include one of the concerns that I raised with regard to Iran at the moment, the delivery systems, the missiles. So maybe if we can move for the WMD free zone region, maybe the missiles could be included in that package as well, which could mean a separate track. Now, what could be the eventual impact of the Abraham Accords on the JCPOA? Frankly speaking, I don't see any, or very, very limited, obviously. It is not about the Iranian nuclear program, even if in the hindsight, in the background, everyone has started to think of it. But what can be the impact of the Abraham Accords on the zone? I don't think that it will have a direct impact. First of all, we have seen from previous experiences that compartmentalization, although this seems to be the new buzzword in international relations, but that it has been there and it was very much possible, which means that you can separate different issues when you start to talk, when you start negotiations. Plus, we have had already examples. Egypt is the best outstanding example. Egypt has concluded a peace treaty with Israel, and still Egypt was the leader of the Arab group of states at all NPT review conferences and at all disarmament issues, mostly WMD, nuclear, chemical, biological. So this does not mean if a country comes to an agreement with Israel, that doesn't mean that it will change its opinion on the zone itself. And none of the Abraham Accord states have a real significance over the zone issue. I am very sorry to say, I know that a treaty is universal, or a treaty is in full force if everyone, even the smallest, the most irrelevant, joins. But I don't think that on the zone, these countries would have a real impact by their conclusion with this acknowledgement, with these accords with Israel. And my last thought is that we have to understand, and this is not a new phenomenon, we have to understand that at least for the past 10 years, there have been different Arab opinions regarding nuclear issue. In the Maghreb, I have to tell you, there is not much interest in the Israel nuclear capability, and there is not much interest in the perceived Iranian threat. It's too far away. If they join up with the other Arab countries, it is for sympathy or something else, but not a real threat perception. In the Mashrek, I just read 2 weeks ago an article, someone was quite surprised to find that Egypts are still stuck with the Israeli nuclear capability. In the Levant, in the Mashrek, it is still the Israeli nuclear capability, which is the more important element. And in the Gulf, it is the eventual Iranian threat, which is perceived by some. I would not even dare to say that this threat perception is shared by all the GCC members who are to the closest to Iran. So I would say that the impact of the Abraham Accords on either the JCPOA or on the WMD free zone in the Middle East would be very, very small, if at all, symbolic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ERZSÉBET, for your very blunt remarks. And since you mentioned the withdrawal from the JCPOA, and you also mentioned that it seems that the leverage to interlink those concepts might not be as some are hoping. Let us now go to our next speaker. It is Shireen Hunter. Nice to see you again. She's an honorary fellow at Georgetown University in Washington. She's an independent analyst with more than 50 years of experience in international affairs and a former diplomat. It's also nice to see you again via Zoom this time. But maybe also since you heard what ERZSÉBET was saying, and when it comes, let's talk a little bit more about the role of Iran in this context. We remember the withdrawal of the US, we remember the maximum pressure politics, which nearly led to an escalation, like an escalation in the sense of the outbreak of a war, which was a possibility at one time. And then, of course, we also see now what Iran is doing, maybe also in light of the upcoming elections. There are elections in Iran in June. Presidential elections, but we also saw that quite on the beginning after Biden's inauguration that they changed a little bit the strategy. They got a little bit more, I would even say, aggressive when it comes to enrichment of uranium, and the latest decision also of more or less from the hardliner fractions to reduce the inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So my question to you would be, what would be your outlook in the sense of a possible return to the JCPOA from this point of view, from this time? So more the Iran and JCPOA question themselves. And of course, if you want, you can also talk about the Abraham Accords. How are they perceived within Iran as it is?
That's right. And what it does, you know. Well, let me just, first of all, to briefly, as a kind of introduction, say that all these issues, whether it is JCPOA or whether it is the question of the nuclear-free zone, which really actually dates back to the 1960s. The first proposal for a nuclear-free Middle East was made actually by Iran during the monarchy. And so this is, nothing new, but every generation has to discover itself. So this is just as it is. All this issue was really related to the struggle for power and supremacy. Definitely, Israel, the fact that Israel has had nuclear weapon has given it a tremendous advantage in the power game in the region. For example, in addition to other factors, for example, Israel could not just go in and out of Lebanon or Syria or other places almost, with impunity if it wasn't for the, this nuclear supremacy that it has. So therefore, from the beginning, I would say that the idea of a nuclear-free zone without the participation of Israel is just a non-starter. And I would be hard-placed to see any time that Israel will agree to give up its nuclear advantage. The other thing in general related to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, basically the goal of Non-Proliferation Treaty was to prevent other states from acquiring nuclear capability, because that would have changed the balance of power. US and Europe had, and Britain had some, and then France had forced the trap. Of course, this gave them superiority, and of course, the USSR. So they had non-proliferation, thou shalt not acquire nuclear weapons. But it ages me, but I participated in the first NPT review conference in Geneva in 1975. And as I see issues coming, there has been no change in the dynamics of the non-proliferation. I remember one of the things that was very important those days was the question of Article 6. Because NPT is not just that others should not acquire nuclear weapons, but that nuclear states should reduce and eventually destroy their weapons. And of course, we know that this hasn't been done. So this also gets to you the question of the limits of multilateralism. I served in UN for 5-6 years, and so I'm familiar with that. But this is just a side. So to me, the idea that you can have a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East is impossible, because that would require having the Israelis to give up their nuclear advantage And I think that's not going to happen, and nobody is going to force them. In fact, one of the reasons that, for instance, and I'm not saying that it is not cause for concern, but one of the reasons that everybody was so exercised about Iran having a weapon, because if Iran had a weapon, it's not, use it. I mean, after all, USSR and US did not use nuclear weapons against each other. It was a deterrent force. It limited some of their actions. And the same way, India and China, they haven't used nuclear weapons against each other, or Pakistan for that matter. But it has, I'm sure that Pakistan's nuclear weapons had deter India from going. So what has Iran also, the reason, I guess, if any reason that Iran wanted to move towards having a nuclear capability, military nuclear capability, was partly because of the Iraqi attack, and also part of the whole question of pressure, regime change, and so on. So that is my view on the nuclear thing. I actually see more proliferation. I would say that Saudi Arabia, if they get out of this current, Khashoggi and the internal succession issues, I think that they will move. And some people think that they already have. And of course, there were rumors that Pakistan had promised them that they would give them access to their nuclear weapons. I think is out of question, because Saudi-Pakistan relations are somewhat not as warm as they were. So this is my view. As to the Abraham Accord, I think that obviously has created more, advantages for Israel. Basically, it has now a legitimate foothold in the Persian Gulf. And it's now in Iran's neighborhood everywhere. Basically, Israel has encircled Iran. They are present in Azerbaijan, and we saw that what happened during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And so they are in the north, and now they are in the south. And so, so Iran is basically encircled with Israel. So this has obviously improved Israel's conditions. But as to whether it has contributed to anything of the resolution of the Palestinian problem, I very much doubt it. And also, this is very much an issue between the current leaders of, say, Bahrain. Bahrain is not an independent actor, and the UAE. This is really basically Israel riding the US wave. If the US slightly changes its attitude, all these things will be different. So it is like Israel is the moon that is reflecting the light of the sun, which is the United States. Well, and there are others, the same thing with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. I think that Iran has to look into these developments and reassess its strategy. However, the way I see it, and this brings me to Jcpoa, and then I will stop, but the way I see it, neither the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, which really basically is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because other Arab states, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Bahrain is really a colony of Saudi Arabia. It's not an independent. Sheikh Khalifa is a joke. Let's face it. And unfortunately, Iranians see these countries as jokes, but they are not jokes, because they can be used as instruments of great power politics. So I think that Iran has to take all these things into account and reassess its priorities and its strategy. But the problem is that the demands that the US has been making on Iran, which amounts to absolute surrender on everything. You have to get out of Yemen, you have to get out of here, you get out of there, you cannot have ships in the Mediterranean, you can't have railway to the Mediterranean. So basically, it's just to confine Iran in a sort of a zone of that they cannot act or anything. And I don't think that any Iranian government if you have, the most democratic government in Iran or the most pro-Western government in Iran, Iranian opposition doesn't say these things because they have their own agenda against Iran. It's not going to accept that. This is a question of acceptance. And I think that the Jcpoa symbolizes this. Jcpoa and Iran nuclear issue, the reason it became so hard is because it is the symptom of these underlying problems and not the cause. Why is that US does not get exercised or Israel does not get exercised with Pakistani, bomb? Because Pakistan does not challenge Israel, Iran made the biggest mistake and was that they challenged Israel. But now I think that the expectations of the Israelis have gone further. I think both the Arab states in the region and some of Iran's other neighbors basically want to see the nuclear standoff to continue, because this continues to weaken Iran, and also it increases the chance that the US might again attack Iran. All these things happening in the Persian Gulf and other areas, attacks on ships, on Iranian ships and Israeli ships and so on. I don't know what they are, or in Iraq. They can be false flag operations, because, the famous Roman saying, cui bono, whom it benefits. Under current circumstances, I don't think that the Iranians want. And we have had on important instances when there was a chance of a breakthrough in US-Iran relations, we had an incident. It was all kinds of things in 2002 and before that. So I personally, I'm not very optimistic. Kissinger used to say, when in doubt, be pessimistic. And so I am going to be slightly pessimistic. I don't see the Biden administration either willing. Certainly, Secretary of State Blinken is the hardliner on Iran and other issues like Syria and so forth, and even on Afghanistan. And so I don't see them doing anything that could encourage Iran to, for example, you don't lift sanctions, but they could have at least allowed the Koreans to free blocked Iranian dollars. And Iran desperately needs that, and it's not going to buy weapons with it, with food. And so I think that this is, and I think that Blinken was instrumental on that. So I really don't see anything, happening. And the Iranians, the way I see it, they're not going to do anything. And the next Iranian government could probably be really a military government. They're not going to change the system, but I think that the president might be a former military, a retired military. This is not a basic issue. And so I think that we have lost the opportunity with Iran many times. And I think that Rouhani was the last. So I think Iranians are going to hunker down. And one last word I would say, actually, with the maximum pressure, I think there has been some effort to, to reform at least many of the management and other things and focus more on domestic production. And so, I think it has been a jolt to them. So I think that in the way I see it, that's the way they are going to go. I wouldn't advise that, but I think that that's the way they are going to go.
Thank you very much, Shireen, for this presentation, which is also doesn't seem to be that optimistic, but we will see what the others are going to comment about.
I hope I am wrong. I hope I am wrong, but
yeah. Thank you very much. Let's move now to our next speaker. Welcome, EXEQUIEL LACOVSKY. He's a research associate at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It's a pleasure to meet you for the first time. And maybe you can, and I know that you have been extensively writing, especially on the nuclear weapon-free zone and what could it entail and what could be the conditions under which it could be established. So what it could actually bring to a peaceful region, like if it is a feasible solution. And now maybe also after you heard, of course, what Shireen was saying about talking about a nuclear weapon-free zones there without Israel already seems to be like a very loose start. So my question to you would be, if you can explain us a little bit about the nuclear weapon-free zone, like what conditions would it need, what would it add, and maybe you can also try to link it to the Abraham Accords and if they could help facilitate to introducing this again.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, to some extent, this opportunity is an opportunity to present my first book that is based on my dissertation. The book is called Nuclear Weapons Free Zones, a Comparative Perspective, that was published the last week by Routledge. So my interest in nuclear weapons free, when I start reading about nuclear weapons free zone, I found a missing point in the literature. That is assessing the drivers or scope conditions for the establishment of nuclear weapons free zones. I found that the literature focused mostly on the legal aspect of the different treaties, or the diplomatic history of each treaty. And of course, most of the literature focused on the Middle East. With a simple search on Google, we'll find that there is much more writing about the potential nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East rather than the other zones. So it's puzzling. And this brings us to the general debate in non-proliferation. What is more important, non-proliferation mechanism or political conditions for non-proliferation agreements? Of course, there is no, both are not mutually exclusive, but I stress the need for political conditions for non-proliferation agreements. So in my book, I address two questions. Under what conditions can nuclear weapons free zones be established? And the answer to this question leads us to the impact on the Middle East. According on what happened on other zones, we can understand or assess the challenges that the Middle East faces. So in my book, I compare 6 cases, the 5 nuclear weapons free zones, the existing nuclear weapons free zones, and the Middle East as a potential nuclear weapons free zones. And I test 4 hypotheses or scope conditions. First, I analyze the role of security conditions, if the regional state value the common security, if they value security regimes in order to address security threats, including nuclear ones. I analyze liberal conditions, the role of regional institutions, democracy, and regional economic cooperation. I analyze also the role of regional powers in the establishment of nuclear weapons free zones. And my last condition is constructivist, is normative. If there is a shared interest in spreading non-proliferation norms and regimes within regions. Of course, because of the time limitation, I cannot address all the existing nuclear weapons free zones, but I can assess the conditions. If I can assess now the Middle East case, and as you see, as you may imagine, I'm not optimistic. Why? First of all, I don't see that there are security conditions that allow for establishing a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East. Israel, for instance, is a nuclear capable state. Iran is a nuclear crucial state. There are chemical weapons programs. And I think that Middle East countries don't value common security, don't value regional security regimes in order to address any kind of threat, not only nuclear ones. Maybe I'm mistaken, but if with the exception of the security border regime between Israel and Egypt, there are no security regimes in the Middle East. So that is it's an element that we have to take into account. Regarding liberal conditions, the role of democracy is difficult to assess because most nuclear weapons-free zones actually were established by a mix of democracies or authoritarian regimes. And it seems that democracy is not a condition for arms control. But what is important from the cases I study, that it's very important, the regional economic interdependence and the effectiveness of regional organizations. I saw that this is spillover from regional cooperation and regional, in different areas, environment, economy, to security. So if states cooperate in different areas, there is a chance that they will cooperate in security. For instance, in the case of Argentina and Brazil, the nuclear rapprochement was carried out in parallel to the economic integration process. So no nuclear weapons free zone was established in a vacuum. There are no regional economic organizations such as Mercosur in South America, the European Union, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, and I think that, and in addition, there is no much cooperation in other issue areas. In the last years, we witnessed some cooperation in the gas exploitation in the Mediterranean, in the East Mediterranean. That is a positive trend. But in general terms, there's low cooperation in the Middle East. In the third place, the role of regional powers. That is very important. That they are the most important regional. They are the more important states in the regions. Not only in terms of military capabilities, economic capabilities, population, economy, but in terms of promoters of regional order, regional governance. I don't see that there are regional powers in the Middle East. Israel, for obvious reasons, cannot exercise regional leadership because it's not recognized by most of the states of the area. And Egypt, that is the most important Arab country and is a very important voice in terms of non-proliferation negotiations, cannot translate its international clout into regional into the regional arena. For instance, Egypt failed to mediate or find a solution to the Syrian civil war. I think that there are no countries that can in the Middle East that can promote governance or regional order. And the last condition is about the shared interest in and belief in the non-proliferation norm. And again, the Middle East witnessed the use of chemical weapons in the war in the 60s, in the war between Egypt and Yemen, in the 80s between Iran and Iraq, in the war, the Iraqi-Iran war, the last years in the Syrian civil war, And the Middle East also witnessed the existence of nuclear weapons programs. So there is no great belief in the non-proliferation norms. So as a conclusion, I think that there are no conditions for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. I'm sorry for being pessimistic. However, the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East will continue to be on the table. For instance, in the NPT conferences, the non-proliferation community will still talk about the nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. However, what I see is I see a possibility of a security dialogue between Israel and some Arab countries. In particular, as a consequence of the Abraham Accord, I think that regional cooperation in every single case has a spillover effect on security. The region that cooperate in different areas, in the end, they will start talking about nuclear issues. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. LACOVSKY. To sum up, or maybe to summarize very, very shortly, it seems that the political conditions do not really seem to be the best ones in the region in order to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. And maybe we can also later discuss about it, since there is one in Africa where all the political conditions are not really perfect as well. So maybe we can also in a second round maybe talk about this as well. But before we go to that, I would like to welcome now HEINZ SWOBODA. HEINZ SWOBODA is president of the IIP, and he used to be MEP in the European Parliament for more than 18 years. And of course, my question to you will be about the role of the European Union in the context. I mean, we all know about the geopolitical European Union, the geopolitical European Commission, which was introduced by von der Leyen. We know that the European Union especially had a very important role when it comes to the creation of the Jcpoa. But what about the Abraham Accords? I mean, how are they perceived in Europe? We were not really a big part of that. And of course, with the nuclear weapon-free zone, it's seems to be similar. So this is even more on the United Nations level. So HEINZ, welcome first. And my question is about the role of the European Union in the region. Should it be there? What is the European perspective? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm very glad to see you all and can take part in this very interesting discussion. First of all, one has to be realistic. I'm also not very optimistic. So I join you, but realistic in the sense what concerns the European Union. Most of the countries don't like a stronger role of the European Union. The US is sometimes, they like it, but Trump didn't like it at all. Biden will like it more. Israel doesn't like it very much because the European Union is seen to be too positive on the Palestinian issues or for the Palestinians and too naive concerning Iran. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates don't like strong engagement of the EU because they say, well, you only deal with human rights and that's not, the most important thing. So this is the one element. We have to be very clear. Secondly, of course, we can do something. We do something on the humanitarian level and many other issues. But it is limited. But what the European Union in the long run could offer, of course, is a model how to overcome some of the difficulties and the characteristics EXEQUIEL just mentioned. Because that is the basic reason why there is no some steps at least towards a nuclear weapons-free zone or zone of mass weapons of mass destruction. Because if we look into the region, we have, first of all, on the one hand, we have not the real recognition yes, let's say recognition of sovereignty of the states. And on the other hand, we don't have any level of strong cooperation. If you look at the different states, and one thing we did not mention yet, but it's now 10 years that we have a war in Syria, and it's not able, and the neighbors were not able to solve the issues there, other countries as well. But we have Syria. Syria is not Syria. Syria, we have Syrian influence, we have Iranian influence, we have Russian influence, we have some Turkish influence. For example, Lebanon. Lebanon, we have a strong Iranian influence on some of the issues. Yemen, we have another war where we have a strong influence from the outside. So there's always this power game still there. Europe could start to have a different path of development when they recognized, after two terrible world wars and many other wars before, think about the wars between France and Germany, that all these power games will never be solved. You have to find a new balance where everybody has some respect and can live his life or her life, and that human rights are more respected. EXEQUIEL is right when he says democracy is not the precondition for it. But if you have permanently this power game, I want to be stronger. No, you can't be stronger. We have to restrict you. You will never have the minimum of trust which is needed for cooperation. Iranians don't trust the others and they want to develop their influence. Maybe in some reasons they have some good reasons for it. But on the other hand, they do it in a way where they support some regime like the Assad regime, or they help to make Lebanon a failed state. It's not only Iran, but it's one part of it. So there is no basis for common discussion and say, let's think about how we can form the basic conditions to have a fruitful debate about a nuclear arms-free zone. And look at the Yemen war is another issue. Again now, and I don't want to accuse the one or excuse the other. When Biden said, no, we go back from the policy of Mr. Trump, for example, concerning the Houthis, and don't call them an extremist terrorist organization. It was used by the Houthis to extend their war and their expansionist policy inside Yemen, which of course is not helping either to promote a more positive Biden's policy. So I think that's a problem. The basic problem is there is no common thinking in the countries in order to establish a new security order, a new security structure, out of which we can come to a zone without nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. Now to your question about the Abraham Accords. I think the Abraham Accords have positive effects and negative effects. The positive effect is that finally neighbors speak with each other. It's not a very natural issue if you are neighboring countries and you don't speak. At least you don't speak officially. Unofficially already there were discussions in the past. So to have recognition of the fact that Israel is existing is very important, very good. The negative elements are, first of all, that the Palestinian issue is no longer on the table. You can say that's realistic, but on the other hand, it's really a shame for the world that basically it's the only people where there is no, let's say they are still subjugated and there is no possibility to give them the possibility either to be equal citizens of Israel or to have an independent state, in some way even limited independent state. Secondly, for Biden and for Trump at least, it was combined with new weapons. We should not forget, Biden promised new weapons, fighters for the Emirates and other countries, which is not helping, which is not helping with stability. And then, And the third element is the Abraham Accords were in some way accords against Iran to strengthen the alliance of Israel with the Arab countries against Iran. This is not a good basis. So if you would, and if Biden can turn around the basic elements of the Abraham Accords and say, this accord should be, as EXEQUIEL already mentioned, the basis of new understanding in the region of cooperation across the borders, across the question if you're a Jew or an Arab, if you're Israel or an Arab country. And it can extend it at least as an aim for the future to all the countries in the region, including Iran, then the Arab Accords could be an important step forward. For the moment, I think neither Netanyahu nor the crown princes in the Emirates or in Saudi Arabia think about this purpose of the Abraham Accords. It's still an instrument against Iran, but it could go in that direction. Finally, on the Jcpoa, I hope still that an agreement can be found, but it would need that in addition, not at the same moment, maybe later, in addition, Iran, and that was also the original purpose, we should not forget that, Iran can be brought into a more broader security structure with more responsibility for the development in the whole region. If you look at, and I have great sympathies for Iran, but if you look what is happening in Lebanon, as they are part of a corrupt structure in Lebanon, not fighting against corruption, but being part of it. If you look what is happening in Syria, part of a corrupt structure, corrupt warlord structure, even with limited possibilities. And then this is my final argument. I fully endorse that sanctions should be lifted against Iran because they are unfair, they hurt the people and so on. But if I read that partly sanctions and the lack of money and dollars are preventing Iran from establishing stronger strongholds in Syria, I can understand that the US is considering, or is, let's say, is critical about lifting sanctions when it means more influence in Syria, more activities in Syria. So let's be realistic. Yes, we should do something. We should support, we should restart Jcpoa as an important element, but it should be clear we could not stop there. And we should fight for a more, let's say, comprehensive security structure, which finally, maybe at some day, can come to a nuclear-free zone, arms-free zone. But before a new stable security structure will be here, Israel will never forget or will never say, okay, we can leave it and we will give our nuclear armaments away, because that's not happening. So Israel must be part of a security structure, and in that sense, Abraham Accords could be a small step forward if it is used in this sense of a comprehensive agreement.
Thank you very much, Hannes, for your remarks. To be realistic also when it comes to the possibility of the role and the impact the European Union can have. But I mean, you also mentioned it could be in diplomacy, on humanitarian issues, but of course also as a model to overcome, as what EXEQUIEL also was mentioning, that there is this lack of regional security regimes in general, and also this lack of political conditions in order actually to go there. Before I move now to our next speaker, I would like to remind all our participants to post their questions in the Q&A section below if they have any question. I also hope that Shireen is going to be able to reconnect. I just see we lost her, so my colleague is writing her. But HEINZ, let me also introduce you. HEINZ is professor at Vienna University, and is also chair of the advisory board of the International Institute for Peace. So thank you very much, HEINZ, for joining us. And he has also been quite responsible when it comes to the whole setup of the series we are discussing right now. But maybe I think Hannes already gave you some buzzwords as well. I mean, he was talking a little bit about the Abraham Accords, which are interpreted to be against Iran in general. So the question would be about the Abraham Accords and what does it mean for regional and international security? But of course, what future do you see for the JCPOA, maybe also in light of linking the whole through concepts together to the title of our event, which is back to multilateralism. So also in the context of the US, like what role can it be? So please try to bring everything together, but also feel free to trust on what you want to say.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for chairing this event. Also, I want to thank the IAB that it organizes the series on multilateralism, US, and several other issues. And of course, I want to thank all of you that you agreed to participate in this timely and topical webinar and discussion. Being the last speaker, usually you should have a more optimistic, positive outlook. I don't. So you can correct me then later on a little bit, maybe, but not too much. But what I do is to link the three significant events, as you said, Stephanie, the JCPOA, the normalization, the Abraham Accords, and the nuclear weapon-free zone Middle East. And in contrast to ERZSÉBET, I see a strong link here. So we should discuss it later on anyway. So how they are connected. I start first with the JCPOA. Let me say that the JCPOA is the best negotiated arms control agreement in history, with a very comprehensive verification system. And in contrast, what we hear from some leaders, and especially Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, it doesn't have an expiration date. It is permanent. If you read the preamble, it says Iran never will achieve nuclear weapon, and this is based on international law. So the UN Resolution 2231, there is the preamble included as the whole agreement. So probably I don't have to repeat it. Trump left the JCPOA May 2018. It was a violation of international law in that case, and Iran abided by it 1 year longer and then started to reduce its commitment itself. But when Trump left the JCPOA, his Secretary of State set 12 conditions, which basically were conditions for surrender. So Iran never could have met them anyway. But some of them survived. So, and two of them are, ERZSÉBET mentioned them already, that is regional issues and the missile issue. So they are basically go back to this 12 conditions of Pompeo. Of course, we could and we should talk about this issue, but to link them directly to the JCPOA is deeply flawed. Why? Regional behavior. There is no arms control agreement in history which includes behavior. So we wouldn't have any arms control agreement during the Cold War. In contrast, it was seen as a signal, of a sign of detente and success when we had arms control agreements during the East-West tensions. So arms control agreements are a good thing when there are tensions. Regional behavior is not part of any, cannot be part of an agreement, but I have also to say there are many other actors in the region which behave in a destabilizing way. So all of them have their proxies, their non-state actors, who they support. So it's not just Iran. Second, missiles. Of course, missiles are part of arms control agreements, as we know, and we have, for example, the New START agreement has a limitation on launches. However, there is no arms control agreement which only limits the conventional weapons, the missiles of one country. So if you talk about missiles, there has to be a regional arms control arrangement, regional arms control talks. And if you look at the Saudi missiles, they have already a longer range than the Iranian missiles so far. Also, we know about the capabilities of Israeli missiles. And the defense expenditures of Saudi Arabia, for example, are 8 times higher than those of Iran. So conventional arms control agreement, regional arrangements, yes, that's the forum to address it, but not the Jcpoa as such. So we have now President Trump and his Secretary of State out of office, but still we have the arguments here. We have the same arguments continuing, which are picked up by Republicans in Congress, by Democrats, by media, by some Europeans. Actually, in brackets, I want to say, because we had this debate about sanctions. Another sign why Trump arguments remain in the US administration, the Biden administration, is if they don't lift sanctions on Iran, but they don't lift sanctions on threats with sanctions on Europe, so they don't lift the sanction, or they don't do away with the threat of sanctions on European companies which want to do business with Iran. So it limits European capability to act independently. So there's another leftover from the Trump administration, despite all this talk about new transatlantic partnerships. So why are these arguments remaining? So the best thing to limit the nuclear program of Iran would be the Jcpoa. So there must be something else, and it's not just it's not just the nuclear program. It's Iran. It's Iran. It's Iran itself. So here the power game that Hannes mentioned comes in, and if you look at the geopolitical position of Iran, it has a very, very strong geopolitical position in this region. If you look at international rankings, Iran is still on the 14th position globally. So if you use criteria like size, population, working infrastructure, discipline of the military, education of the people, land-sea relations, nuclear weapons are not included. And in spite of the relatively low military expenditure of Iran. So strong geopolitical position and now power game. What do neighbors do if they are afraid of a strong geopolitical factor in the region? According to the balance of power theory, they built an alliance. They built an alliance, and there are all kinds of attempts to build alliances now in the Middle East, and one of them are the Abraham Accords. So I see, in contrast to others, not only the possibility of dialogue between Arab states and Israel and cultural and economic exchange, I see an alliance, at least in the making. There are no defense guarantees yet, that's too early, but if you look at the agreement documents, they speak of a strategic agenda for the Middle East. We should not forget that Donald Trump was one of the signatories of the Abraham Accords. And according to the document, they should prevent hostile acts hostile activities in the region. And we should not forget that at the same time, Israel has been moved from the Pentagon, from the Central Command, from the Euro Command to the Central Command in the Middle East. And the reason what the Pentagon gave, look at the website, you can see it. The reason are the Abraham Accords. They say they offer a strategic opportunity to unify partners of the US in the region against common threats. So the common threat only can be, of course, Iran. So it was also mentioned by Hannes that the losers of the Abraham Accords are not only Iran, but also the Palestinians. Why? Because they desert the idea of recognition of Israel within the borders of '67. So that was the idea. Actually, Obama supported this idea, so wanted to orient some of them on the '67 borders. But there is the Arab Peace Plan of 2002, says we have land for peace and we recognize Israel and have diplomatic relations with Israel within the borders of '67. So that's has been abandoned, and now the room for a two-state solution is getting smaller with this Abraham Accord. So the Palestinians are victims of this agreements, of these accords as well. So finally, what does it mean? My last connection here, there are connections. My last connection, nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. Sorry. So if I'm right that the Abraham Accords, and I have more quotes here, so that would take too much time to cite them. If the Abraham Accords are an alliance in the making, they are becoming a nuclear alliance, because Arab states will have an alliance with a nuclear state. The nuclear state is Israel. That means, on the one hand, if this is happening, and maybe even there will be a clandestine nuclear umbrella by Israel over Arab states. So, in the case Iran should develop nuclear weapons or something, nuclear. So, if that is the case, of course, it would stimulate Iran's nuclear program again. So Iran will not going to hold back. So it's the opposite is happening. So it will not reduce Iran's commitments to nuclear ambitions, but it would stimulate it. Second, it would be the end of the nuclear weapon-free zone Middle East. In addition to that, what EXEQUIEL already mentioned, but then we don't have this common cause, what Shireen mentioned at the beginning, the common cause of Arab states and Iran is disappearing, because you have now this ties between Israel and some Arab states. Maybe Saudi Arabia might join later. We don't know. So I could stop here. I will say two more optimistic words, Stephanie, if I may.
You can also save them for the last round, maybe.
Good. Okay. All right. Yeah. No, only pessimism. Fine.
But please, take them in your head, because we already got many questions and there is still then some time. And I think, yeah. So I see Shireen is also managed to come back.
I'm sorry, I got my internet went down briefly. Thank you.
No problem. Maybe since ERZSÉBET, it has been some time since you have been speaking, and there is already a question which is directed to you. It is from Tom Sauer, and he asked what will be the impact of a possible victory of the conservatives in the Iranian elections on the chances to rescue the Jcpoa. So please, this question is directed directly to you, but also feel free to reflect a little bit on what the speakers after you have been saying.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Shireen.
No, go ahead. I think it was addressed to you, right? Okay,
yes,
no,
it was addressed to ERZSÉBET.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't know that Tom Sauer was listening in, so I am really happy. Okay. I think that every day the chance is increasing, and I think Shireen already pointed out that there would be a more conservative or a hardliner. Shireen even said that maybe even a military personality leading the new Iranian government and becoming the new president. However, and maybe Shireen will correct me on that, I have had the feeling for the past 2 years or so that practically all the Iranian political figures want to come to an agreement. The question is how, on what terms, and not the agreement itself. And now there was a lot of talk that it would have been easier with a Republican US president. Now I saw it in one of the questions that maybe with a hardliner Iranian president, it would be easier. I don't know, but I think that there are so many indications that everyone, and when the Supreme Leader himself says that we can come to an agreement within hours, if the conditions are met, I think that that is a very strong indication that under certain circumstances, Iran, any fragment, any faction in the Iranian foreign policy would be ready to come to an agreement. But again, the question is how. And here, I would just like to make 2 remarks with agreeing most of what was said before by my colleagues. What I see could be a chance, and Hannes, I am turning this also to you because I have the feeling that this is where the European Union could have a role, and I think you were also pointing to that, a kind of a mediating role, helping to go forward with negotiations. And I heard it from, well, President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif about 2 years ago raised the issue of coming back to the idea of a Gulf regional security architecture, which they called HOPE, the Hormuz of peace endeavor or something like that. And as if I understood, I listened to many Iranian colleagues on different webinars that what could be maybe the way out is that try to go back to the Jcpoa, but parallelly start a track on a regional kind of thing in which the regional countries could be involved. And it was even said by Iranian colleagues that they could accept the United States as the supervisor. Okay, they would like to call in Russia as the other supervisor, just to have a kind of a balance. So and the colleagues who were saying it, well, at least I think there is such an Iranian thinking. Maybe others will win in the elections. It will all go a different way, but I think, and the other issue, very briefly, that I would have liked to say that we are speaking about Israel as if Israel was a non-changing actor. But the point has come this year when the demographic balance has come to equal between the Jewish population of Israel and the Palestinians. Of course, who count what and how, but this demographic balance that has been mentioned in the past 10 years at least as a kind of a threat or a kind of a challenge for how Israel should go on is now there. Approximately the same number of Jewish citizens as the same number of Arab citizens of Israel, and the stateless Palestinians on the territories, not even in the neighboring state, on the territories, which means that approximately 6 to 8 million Arabs, about 2 million or 1.5 million have citizenship, all the others are without citizenship. So what I don't see, this is a challenge to Israel. What I see is that the Netanyahu governments do not want to deal with this issue. They think that it can be still postponed a little bit, but sooner or later, no way that Israel, from a domestic political point of view, has to deal with that, especially that I am much more pessimistic on the chances of a Palestinian state. No chance at all. There is no territory. No territory, not even two territories. Even within one territory, there is no three separate batches of territory. It's all like an Emmentaler-Käse. So it is impossible. Thank you. I'm sorry to be so long. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, ERZSÉBET, also for setting the focus a little bit on that question as well. Shireen, since it has been already a time since you were speaking, there is a question which asks, kindly please let me have your comment on why Iran still continues its developments, especially on defense issues like drones and missiles under heavy sanctions. So the question is, how is it possible? From where does Iran get support? But please, of course, also feel free to add to what the other speakers after you have been saying.
If I might, I will address the question of a hardliner would be more willing to. This has been going on at least for 40 years now. People saying a hardliner would be more willing to, sign agreement, and some others have said a moderate will be, and we have seen them come and go, Rafsanjani, Khatami, and so on. The question is really that we have to, and to be honest with you, I think some of this goes back even before the revolution. I don't want to open old can of worms of how the Iranian Revolution happened, what role outside powers played in. But the fact is that Iran is a middle-sized country. At a very important, maybe Persian Gulf's impact will be reduced because, the oil economy will disappear and we are moving towards green fuel and so on. But the fact is that Iran is a middle power. Great powers don't like middle powers. And of course, the regional powers don't like middle powers either. The whole question of Israel harking on Iran's terrorism and so on, it's not just that. I mean, Israel wants to show Iran is a threat so that it prevent also economic relation between Iran and the other side of the Arab side of the Persian Gulf. And now they are going to Dubai and doing all these sort of things. So it's just very important to do that. The question is that what terms we are offering Iran. For example, the idea to say that Iran just has to let Saudi Arabia to dominate the Persian Gulf is just not acceptable. On the other side, Iran is facing Turkey and Turkey's ambitions. I don't know whether some of you have been following that. What Erdogan has been saying is a direct challenge to Iran's territorial integrity. And I don't know why Turkey can go in and out of Syria and nobody complains about it. And Turkey can go in and out of northern Iraq and nobody complains about it. Iran has security interest in Iraq. To say that you just simply has to get out of Iraq without having a settlement
You just froze again. I think the interconnection is bad again.
For reasons that Ben Salman had. Nobody is taking it. And Obama supported it and everybody else supported it. So the question is not radical or left wing. Where does Iran get its weapons? A lot of it is copying, reverse engineering. Iranians have made considerable advances in some of the technologies. Maybe initially they got some help from North Korea and maybe China, but there are a lot, the drones and so on, a lot of it is just, reverse engineering. And I think one of the reasons that Israel is so obsessed with Iran is because of this. The fact is Egypt is gone, Iraq is divided, Syria is a shambles, Sudan and Morocco and so on are really of no account. And so the only standing country is Iran. And so they want to solve the Iran problem. that's why I don't think we will have any return to JCPOA. And the Persian Gulf dialogue, Saudi Arabia has been against dialogue with Iran since the 1968 when the British left the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, past is prologue. We can't just start, here without having to see what has been the burden of the past. Again, I apologize, but these are issues that I thought that was worth raising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shireen. There's another question, which is if we could provide the view whether political settlement of disputes such as international institutions-backed United Nations resolutions on Israeli-Palestinian territorial disputes or new formula which parties would accept, if that could lead to nuclear disarmament or the abandonment of nuclear programs. Mr. LACOVSKY, do you want to address that one, maybe?
Yes. One of the official position of Israel is that Israel will engage in arms control negotiation in a nuclear weapons free zone negotiation after a lasting and durable peace between Israel and the Arabs and Islamic countries. That include, of course, the Palestinian issue. But of course, the unsettled dispute between Israel and the Palestinians prevent the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and most of the Islamic countries. This trend is being reversed by the Abraham Accords, but still, we are. Just a few countries recognize, just a few Arabs and Islamic countries recognize Israel. So we are far away from that scenario. And well, we have elections in Israel in 1 week, and the Palestinian issue is completely absent from the political discourse. This is a common element across all the political parties. So I don't see also settlement of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict in the near future.
Thank you very much, Ezequiel. Hannes, would you like to add something on that, maybe?
Yeah, in general, but I want to also to take up what ERZSÉBET said about the role of the European Union. I've been very, very short on that. I think there are three foreign powers or factors which could have an influence and which we should try to convince the regional actors to come to some sort of a basic understanding. It's the US, and therefore I agree it is good that Biden is coming back and paying some attention to the situation in the Middle East. I fully agree with Shireen. It's not the way I would like to have it, but at least there is some engagement. It's the European Union, it's our neighborhood. And what happens in our neighborhoods, look to the refugee issue and so on. Somebody was a recent discussion in Yemen, why are there not more refugees from Yemen? It's a bit far away and it's a difficult way to go. But if Yemen would be nearer to European Union, we would have a lot of refugees from Yemen as well. And it's Russia. Why do we need Russia? And I think the question is also to Heinz, and Heinz will have to say something on that. Well, I think Russia has an influence in Syria, obviously, and Russia would be interested a bit to reduce the influence of Iran in Syria because they want to do the business themselves, yes, but also because they want to protect in some way Israel, and they have some understanding with Israel that they want to reduce a too strong influence or prevent the too strong influence of Iran. So if we have European Union, which has at least some leverage in Iran, has some understanding of the situation of Iran, not as much as perhaps is necessary, but still, if we have the US, who has still also with Mr. Biden strong relationship to Syria, and will have also strong relationship to the Arab countries, even in the Khashoggi case is now a bit a problem. But the fact, which was criticized, but I feel it understandable, that Biden is not sanctioning the crown prince, but only, you know, some of the other people, means he wants to have open some dialogue. And if he wants to have some influence, for example, in Yemen and other countries, he has to speak with the king, but at the end of the day, his ministers also have to speak with the crown prince. And if we can include Russia, because it is here, and Russia would be happy to discuss the situation, perhaps also to prevent the Chinese coming in too strongly, and because Russia wants to keep, of course, its influence in Syria and have that kind of special role to Iran. If these three powers, if you want to say, would understand amidst themselves that with all the difference they have on this region and in this region, they should have some sort of cooperation, they could achieve something. If we are not demanding from Russia to topple Assad, which I would like that he would go away, but he is here, and if we are not saying Russia has no role in the region, because it has a role and is here, I think these three countries, maybe also with some role of Turkey in you know, minor role, but still, I think they could really change in the long term dramatically the situation in the Middle East. But all the three should be engaged. European Union has other interests, has other understanding of democracy than Russia, yes, but it's not about you know, promoting democracy. Then we cannot work together with Russia, but it's promoting stability and some sort of economic development, because at the end of the day, to develop Syria without European Union money and support will not be possible, and that Russia could have some interest. But the European Union, of course, should show that the money is not going to the mafia in Syria, but rather to go to the people who are really poor and need support.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Since you mentioned Russia, there is a question about Russia which is directed to you, Heinz. And the question is, what would be the role of Russia in USA and multilateralism in the relation to the Iran nuclear deal if the Biden administration would collaborate and encourage collaboration for a political settlement? So it's actually quite linked to what Hannes was just saying. And then I would also like to give you another question. Maybe you can address both of them together. So one about Russia, and the other one is from Ambassador Soltanier, who asks if his initiative for a confidence-building measure in the Middle East by a prohibition of armed attack or a threat of attack against the nuclear facilities based on IAEA Resolution 533, if this is a breakthrough. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Of course, these questions have a long tail as well. So if you start talking about it, could have a never-ending story. But let me link the Russia question to what Hannes said before, and then I go back a little bit. ERZSÉBET said we have to have regional dialogue, and he was referring to hope, and there were Sarif also suggested a regional dialogue, and all of you except we participated 2 years ago in this conference where we already talking about regional arms control arrangements, about collective security, confidence building measures. As Ambassador Soltanier mentioned it in a specific case, of course, as well. So regional arrangements and talks are indispensable. So that's many issues can only be addressed on the regional level. Of course, external powers play a role. So, but Iranians, and I would say, stay out as much as you can. Russia, Lavrov 2 days ago made this suggestion saying, we should have something like a OSCE in the Middle East, and confidence building measures. And I would rather go back and refer to the Helsinki Agreement, but that's another story. And we should have outside powers who guarantee this collective security arrangement. And as outside powers, it looks like a multilateral agreement, but these outside powers are United States, China, Russia, India, no European Union, no European Union. But that's not, so European Union is not in the game. But that was also happening when we had the Kushner plan about the Middle East. That's not dead yet, so I don't know what President Biden will do with it. So it would have been, of course, the end of any two-state solution. That what ERZSÉBET described, that there are no states anywhere, and that there wouldn't have been a Palestinian state at all. It would have been a shattered territory. But it was a Kushner plan. The Europeans had all these nice suggestions about the two-state solution for decades going back. The European Union was not mentioned. The United States is part of the Abraham Accords. The European Union is not part of it. So the European Union is not asked. So we have to ask ourselves what is happening here. Why is the European Union not a part of this dialogue? So I was a bit surprised that Lavrov did not mention Europe either. So regional arrangements should include all parties, but now we have the Abraham Accords, which excludes at least Iran. So if Iran is not included, I would even say if Israel is not included, you cannot have an effective regional arrangement. Arms control talks would be one possibility. I have to remind you that Israel already participated in arms control talks in 1992 through 1994, but they collapsed because of this idea of the nuclear weapon-free zone, where this was brought up by Egypt and what Israel could not accept. So that was, but still Israel could be included in arms control talks as well. So now we have the other arms accords which are dividing and not uniting. They are not uniting. So, but Biden is not going to do away with the Abraham Accords. He will keep them. So we will have to live with them. So Iran has to find a way to get back into these regional talks. So the only thing what Iran could do is start a talk on the basis of the Arab Peace Plan 2002 and said, okay, fine, they talk about the recognition of Israel in the border of 67. He should take the Arab states at their word, because the Arab Peace Plan is still in place, so it was not officially abandoned. So it would not desert the Palestinians, and it would bring back Iran into the game. It would be very painful for Iran to say we recognize Israel, we have diplomatic relations with Israel within the borders of 67. But that's not a radical suggestion. As I said, Obama said we should orient our Middle Peace policy on the 67 borders. Of course, Netanyahu didn't want to have them. So that would be one possibility, that Iran comes back into this regional area. On the top of that, we could have maybe arms control negotiations and confidence building measures with all the what is included, what also Ambassador Soltanieh, which is a good suggestion, said that there should be a prohibition on the attack on peaceful nuclear facilities. That's also the Iranian foreign minister is always referring to the UN resolution. I guess it was 587 in 1987 after the when the Iraq-Iran war ended, to create such a regional arrangement. So let me say, if I may, some word to the nuclear weapon-free zone. Probably SQL is right that there's because there's no common ground, no common culture, no common political system, and so it would not work. They only work if you have this common political security environment that SQL mentioned. Okay, that's not true for for the Middle East, but we could have an alternative, which includes that what Esquel was saying. Iran could say, okay, fine, you have this Abraham Accords potential nuclear alliance with Israel and Arab states, so we're not part of this game anymore. Iran could say, I will join the nuclear weapons-free zone Central Asia. So in his excellent dissertation, Esquel already, he told me that, said that Iran tried it to do in 2002 already to join this Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone, but the US prevented it because the US wanted to single out and say we cannot address Iran's nuclear program if Iran is part of a nuclear weapon-free zone Central Asia. Of course, Iran should get something in return, that is negative security assurances, which are part of the protocols of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. That means that nuclear weapon-free zones commit themselves not to use and threaten to use nuclear weapons against the members of the zone. So that's what the US have to accept. But that would be a possibility to underline, to strengthen the Jcpoa as well. So to make the long story short, the US at the same time could put pressure on the Arab allies to join Berlin-Dawa. Egypt already signed the Berlin-Dawa Treaty but did not ratify it. So we would have a long nuclear weapon-free belt, including Mongolia, maybe this small stretch between Russia, Mongolia and Kazakhstan could be overbridged or something, from Mongolia through North Africa. We have Israel, but Israel the rationale of Israel's nuclear weapon would be fading if there is no nuclear weapon state around Israel anymore. There is no nuclear threat against Israel. So at least Israel's nuclear weapons would be a debate. So why are they for? So maybe Israel will never give them up, but they have even to justify them even more. So sorry for that long talk, but I had to finish this.
Okay, so thank you very much, and also for giving us a little bit an optimistic outlook in the end. So maybe not everything is lost when it comes to disarmament in the region. How this is going to be tackled, we will see. I mean, there is some hope, but I also would say there has been a lot of pessimism also there when it comes to institutions, when it comes to conditions, to political conditions, regional conditions. Unfortunately, we are already over time. So if nobody is now saying I really need to add something very important, I would like to close the session and thank you very, very much for joining us. Thanks to our participants. I think it was a very interesting debate. Of course, we were not able to tackle all the big issues. It was mentioned then from Russia to China. Then we have all the conflicts in the region, Syria, Yemen, the Palestinian question, but then of course all the technical approaches also, how to implement and how to get into a more secure world in the region there as well. But so let me thank you again for taking your time, for talking to me, for talking to our participants. I look forward to see you pretty soon, of course, in real life again. That would be my pleasure. And enjoy your evening, enjoy your midday, Shireen, and have a nice day. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
We'll have to have another webinar, Stephanie.
We
have to
definitely
have another webinar. So
okay.
that we will get together again. Take care.
You too. Thank you. Goodbye.